Alhamdulillah, the last time we began our discussion of the Thamaratul Muhimmah, which is roughly translated into English as the desired fruit. And we say this Thamaratul Muhimmah, the desired fruit, is a metaphor pertaining to the result of long contemplation and thinking upon a certain subject matter. Yes, one is bestowed knowledge after long practice, contemplation and discussion. So when Raja Ali Haji, a scholar himself and a member of the royal family himself, wrote of this work, wrote of this treatise, he writes it not merely from the position of scholarship, from the position of somebody who has studied deeply the intellectual tradition of Islam, but also from the point of view of someone who was involved in the governance, in the politics, in the international relations of his time. So when he wrote the Thamaratul Muhimmah, it is written as an advice. It is written as a treatise of ethics and edification in the tradition of the Mirror of the Princess. This tradition, writing mirrors for princes, began long in the intellectual tradition of Islam. Amongst the scholars of note who have written treatises on this subject matter included Imam Al-Ghazali, whose work was known as the Tibrul Masbuk or the Nasihat Al-Muluk, the Counsel for Kings. During that time, someone who was close to Imam Al-Ghazali, the Nizam Al-Mulk, also wrote a treatise on this subject matter. And this tradition continued. Al-Mawardi, for example, wrote a work called the Ahkam Al-Sultaniyah. And these are all, shall we say, books which are written dealing with the subject matter of politics, ruling, in particular, how to achieve justice in these matters. So the Thamaratul Muhimmah stand in this long line of tradition, and according to our teacher, Professor Dr. Khalif Muammar, the political philosophy in the Malay language, shall we say, was first written by Raja Ali Haji, and he was also the last of that tradition, because after that the intellectual tradition in the Malay world suffered a great crisis, in which we find no longer scholars developing from that tradition, but now having to adapt and adopt works coming from the Western intellectual tradition. It is as if now there is a flood of new ideas coming, a flood of new ideas coming into the intellectual marketplace, that now you have to deal within the matrix of ideas coming from a different universe. But Raja Ali Haji stands in the long line of tradition wherein a student studied from a teacher who studied from a teacher, in which this tradition has lasted for hundreds of years in this part of the world. Raja Ali Haji was in the late 19th century, so that means to say he had the pleasure of studying this tradition as it has developed in this part of the world in its maturity. According to Professor Al-Attas, the period of intensification of intellectual activity in this part of the world, shall we say, began intensely from the 15th century to the 17th century. This was the time when the scholars began to write treatises on the meaning of existence. They wrote on philosophy, they wrote on subject matter such as the conception of knowledge, they wrote on the gradations of existence, they wrote also on treatises pertaining to the nature of man and the psychology of the human soul. It was also in the 17th century that Ar-Ranini wrote a multi-volume history of the world, yes, from the beginning of time right down to their contemporary period. Malay historiography had started earlier but reached a certain level of maturity during the 17th century, and by the time it reached the time of Raja Ali Haji, who has himself written a few treatises on history of the Malay people and the formation of Muslim kingdoms, Malay kingdoms, you get already by now a tradition in its full zenith, shall we say. In the Thamaratul Muhimmah, as we have discussed the last time, we said about how his advice for kings is not only ethical in nature, but takes into consideration the form and the shape of government that was available at that time. He divided the government into the rulership of the kings, the Qadi, who was involved and who was responsible for religious matters. There were also people who were, shall we say, within the monarchical system, those who were the trusted person or trusted people by the kings to be doing the administrative duties. So his advice involved all these people who occupy positions of leadership. I remember the last time when we gathered here together to discuss that work, towards the end of the discussion, one of the participants asked, what is the relevance of discussing all these matters now? First, perhaps that person may say, the form of government has changed. We have moved from a position of what is understood using Western concept as the position of absolute monarchy into that of constitutional monarchy mixed with representative democratic government. So there is already a shift in the forms of government. Secondly, there is now installed the matrix that is involved in Malaysian, shall we say, in the political sphere, the birth of a nation state. And with the birth of the nation state, the birth and the formation of new founding ideas about nationhood, such as concepts of a constitution, for example. And furthermore, there is by now the modern university system which enhances and which promotes these ideas, that as if the period before the independence and the period before these modern forms of government lay in, shall we say, relative darkness for us. It becomes a mysterious past, it becomes mythologized. But through the writings and reading the works of these scholars, we come to realize that in fact there were people who were of flesh and blood, and they were people who lived within their own social constructs, and they lived within their own matrix of government and so on. So I answer, despite the changes of government, despite the changes of forms of government, the very people, or rather the very makeup of a government, the very makeup of the political system still involve human beings and leaders. And Raja Ali Haji's advice pertaining to knowledge as the foundation of a peaceful society, knowledge as the foundation of a prosperous society, in particular ethical and religious knowledge as the basis of good governance and the basis of, shall we say, trustworthiness, still remains relevant up till this day. And the basic ethical maxims, such as you shouldn't entrust to a person a certain trust in which he is not worthy, or the Quranic injunction, Inna Allaha ya'murukum an tu'addul amanati ila ahliha, that indeed your Lord commands you to return the trust to its worthy keepers. These basic moral categories, these basic moral injunctions remain relevant up till today. In fact, the opening pages of the Thamaratul Muhimmah, in which Raja Ali Haji, before going into the details of governance, before going into the details of, shall we say, rule and political philosophy, he first explored the question of knowledge. Yes, he began with a discussion on the superiority of knowledge over ignorance. And he did not merely give Quranic and prophetic injunctions. He did not rely merely on the verses of the Quran, nor just the hadith of the Prophet, but he also gave intellectual arguments to suggest that human beings owe their superiority to the other members of the universe precisely due to the knowledge granted unto them. First he said, for example, if a human being were to compete, say, with an elephant, he will lose out in terms of strength. If he were to compete with any of the animals, in any other virtues, the animals will far subdue him. Yes, he cannot, for example, last long under the water compared to the fish, whose natural habitat is to live within the water. He cannot outswim the dolphins. Of course, Raja Ali Haji did not use dolphins as an example. Rather elephants, snakes and others of those type, to show that therefore if a human being, if his virtue is in the other realms aside from knowledge, he will be far surpassed from the other animals. Yet we see, despite the strength and the stamina and the other attributes of virtue that the animals possess, yet they remain under the dominion of human beings. And that having dominion over animals is precisely due to the faculty of thinking, faculty of knowledge. The possession of knowledge, therefore, is that which renders man in control over the universe, or rather over the known universe, over the alam shahada, the taskhir, shall we say. At any rate, and then further, Raja Ali Haji said, another argument to say that knowledge, therefore, is the crowning achievement of human beings is owing to the fact that in the class of human beings, the ones that are highest according to God are the prophets. And the prophets, they are, shall we say, singled out from the rest of humanity precisely because of the knowledge that God entrusts upon them. Nevertheless, this is still recap from the last discussion. Today we want to proceed to the discussion of the types of kings in existence. According to Raja Ali Haji, within the matrix of religion/rule, he said that kings are of three types. One is called Raja Agama, who is the ruler where religion is concerned. That means to say, whose rule is limited to the realm of religion. These are rulers who are kings whose rule conform with the demands and the requirements of the Sharia. They do not command other than what the Sharia commands, or at the very least, they perform the duties that they owe to their religion. And this, what kings owe to the establishment of religion within an Islamic kingdom, has already been spelled out in the Aqaid An-Nasafi. For example, it is his duty to defend the integrity and the safety of the people within the state. The king is also responsible to marry off the youth who are, shall we say, who do not have their own wali in the sense of their fathers. The king is also responsible in the performance of the Jum'ah, Friday prayers, and other duties pertaining to stately duties that the king has to enforce with regards to religion. And if the king performs these duties as outlined in the Aqaid An-Nasafi, he becomes a Raja Agama. He may not be a scholar, but so long as he does this, he is known as a Raja Agama in that sense. The second quality, the one that we are looking for tonight, is the Rabbul Saif wal Qalam, the Lord of Pen and Sword. The Lord of Pen and Sword is a person who becomes a king, either through election, or through succession, or perhaps through taghallab. That means to say, when he takes over power. When, shall we say, for example, there is great calamity in the kingdom, so a crown prince, for example, who has to battle out the other princes, and he becomes the king, having secured his victory against his competitors. He becomes a Rabbul Saif wal Qalam if he is both a king and a scholar at the same time. Such that, according to Raja Ali Haji, he said that he commands people with his pen, meaning to say, using his knowledge. But he has another side, and that is the sword. That means to say, he also has stately powers to enforce the Sharia requirements. The third, according to Raja Ali Haji, is the Raja Hawa. That means to say, a king who follows merely his desires. And this kind of king is the one that Raja Ali Haji warns will be the source of calamity for his people. Because all that he cares about is the fulfillment of his desires. Yes, be it in the form of power or in the form of even more baser desires. So the third type is usually the cause of destruction of nations and states. Because when the kings are, shall we say, when they are the rulers of a nation and they suffer from this inability to curtail their own desires, what will happen is that level 2, level 3 downwards will perform the same things. or they will use their stately powers in order to satisfy their desires. They become hated by the people. And when they become hated by the people, they open up doors for other competitors to power to secure power against them. Yes, the Raja Hawa. So this is how you find it in the concluding pages of the Thamaratul Muhimmah. But I'd like to explore this question deeper, in particular the question of being Lord of Pen and Sword, the Rabbul Saif wal Qalam, because of such a powerful concept that Raja Ali Haji has now proposed to us. Accordingly, of course, if you look at the history of the Islamic intellectual tradition, you will notice that the most perfect king of them all would have been Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This was because he combined within himself the property of being the religious guide of the people, in the sense that he is the highest scholar. In that sense, he is the highest alim, he is the muallim, wa is the mualliman. He was sent as a teacher because he was taught directly by God. And his authority, his authority comes from the realm of knowledge, not from power. But yet, owing to his authority in knowledge, he also was entrusted to become the king in that sense. Meaning to say, he was also given political power. We know from history that during the Meccan period, the Prophet Muhammad was invited, or rather, emissaries from the city of Yathrib were sent to the city of Mecca. Yes, to pledge their allegiance to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, inviting him to come over to Yathrib to become, shall we say, the place whereby the true deen would be enacted. We know that when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to Madinah, he was responsible for the governance of the people in the sense of a king. Whilst at the same time, even from, shall we say, the early period of his ruling in Medina, the challenges did not stop, shall we say. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he ruled Medina under the guidance of revelation from God, he was in that sense the Rabbul Saif wal Qalam. And there is a hadith, in fact, I think, where the Prophet said that the people were first guided by their prophets. Yes. In particular, for example, Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Yes, he was a source of guidance for his people. Prophet Dawood, Prophet Sulaiman, they were kings as well as prophets. They were given knowledge, but at the same time, they were given also political and temporal authority in that sense. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam enacted the perfection, whereby a person like the Prophet, he secured the authority, his authority over people based on his knowledge and his position with God. But at the same time, as we said, he was also the political ruler of the state of Medina. And when he passed, you have a succession of 4 rightly guided Khulafa, the Khulafa al-Rashidin, from Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Sayyidina Umar, Sayyidina Uthman, Sayyidina Ali, in which these 4, they were also in that sense, in that mold. So that's why they were known as the Khalifa. That means to say the successors of the Prophet, in that they combine within them the scholarly knowledge that is required, and at the same time they rule over the people. In fact, if you look at the career of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, he exemplified not only the person of the scholar and the king, but he was also a trader in that sense. So he was also responsible for the economic development of Medina, owing to his experience in international trade, his knowledge of world customs and world culture, his ruling of Medina. You will see, for example, in books of hadith, whereby he elected which place was to become the trading place, and he set the grounds and the rules for trade. He came up with a strategy to overcome the monopoly coming from usurious practices. All these things were done during his time. And he also strategized as to how to defend the integrity of the state against the attacks from external forces. So the microcosm, shall we say, the summary, or shall we say, the pearl of Muslim rule is to be found within the person of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But as time passed, we know that not all kings were like that. Not all kings were scholars, and not all scholars were kings. We know, for example, that Imam Al-Ghazali was very strict in this regard. It is said that he quoted a hadith, Imam Al-Ghazali, in which it is said that the worst of the scholars are those who frequent the company of the rulers, but the best of the rulers are those who frequent the company of the scholars. Yes? The worst of the scholars are those who frequent the company of the rulers, but the best of the rulers are those who frequent the company of the scholars. That means to say that it is the ruler's duty to come to the scholars, not the other way around. Because if you, as a scholar, you were to approach the kings, if you are found knocking on the doors of the king, that means to say you who are responsible for the knowledge which is higher than the material possessions of this world, have now traded your position of being a spiritual guide for the community for the sake of material possessions which are not lasting in that sense. But as a king, if you go to the gatherings of the scholars, if you educate your children to become students of the scholars, you are now changing the entire makeup of the city so that they become people who go after knowledge. We know that after the last of the four, yani Sayyidina Ali bin Abi Talib, you have Sayyidina Muawiyah, who was also a Sahaba, but he initiated a different system of ruling. He initiated, shall we say, the monarchical system. Although they were still known as the Khilafah, although they still defended the integrity of the Sharia to a certain extent, but the historical records also show certain defects in their attributes, in their character, in the rules. This spirit, or there would be this interregnum for a period before you see at the end of the 1st century after Hijrah, the emergence of the Caliph who was known as the 5th of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, Sayyidina Umar bin Abdul Aziz. Now Sayyidina Umar bin Abdul Aziz had a short span of time of rule. He ruled for perhaps 2 to 3 years only. But during this short span of time, because of his character, who is of a man of extreme piety, and a man who feared God, and a man who loved knowledge, and a man who loved the company of scholars, the entire, shall we say, Muslim rule under him became inspired by him in that sense, such that he was recognized by the community of scholars in time as the first mujaddid. That means to say, as the Prophet said, that at the end, at the turn of every century after my passing, there will be somebody to renew the message of the spirit of the message that I brought. And Umar Abdul Aziz was of that year, at the end of that century. And furthermore, Umar bin Abdul Aziz also lived during the times of Hasan al-Basri and a number of very influential scholars in the intellectual tradition of Islam existed during at the same time period. Then you have this category would remain in history, and in the Malay world, on the other hand, you will see that prioritizing knowledge over power had already been seen as early as the earliest, shall we say, historical works, such as the Hikayat Aceh, Hikayat Samudra Pasai, Merah Silu, all these works on history that are meant to write about the history of the kings, including the Sulalatus Salatin, or the Sejarah Melayu. All these works of historiography, according to Professor Tatiana Denisova, another teacher from Cassis, she published a work on reflections on Malay historiography. She wrote there in one of the chapters that the conception of the just king is found in all these works of historiography. All significant major works of history will have conception of the just king. And the just king, one of its attributes that is persistent, that is found throughout all these works, is that they have to be people who love knowledge. Is that they are to be people who love the company of scholars. Is that they are to be people who fear God. These are very persistent. Of course, there are other characteristics that are helpful to becoming a just king, including, for example, having very strong physical properties, having good looks, a number of things. But these are shall we say, coincidental. But the primary ones are always having knowledge and having fear of God. So this is a consistency throughout. That means to say within the, shall we say, 700-year span, from the 13th century right down to the 19th and early 20th century, the conception of the just king is not of the merciless Machiavellian type. Yes, although vigorousness is part of the positive attributes of the king, but it has always been that knowledge and virtue are the primary characteristics and attributes that is required of a ruler, as found in the historiographical works. And then you have, as we said, certain kings who were scholars. You find, for example, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, at least two kings, yes. One was the Sultan of Selangor at that time, Sultan Sulaiman Shah, who ruled at about the same time as Sultan Iskandar Shah of Perak. These two were scholars. They wrote works, relevant works in the field of Aqidah, Fiqh and Tasawwuf. At the same time, they were also entrusted to rule. What is interesting about these two kings, of course, is that they lived during the time in which this part of the world is already living under the rule of the colonial powers. Where, for example, for Selangor, they had to accept British residents to become advisors to the king. That means to say they were forced, shall we say, to accept residents to advise them, especially on the interests of the British, yes, which includes, of course, they are primarily interested in their economic interests, yes, their continuous venture, their ownership of lands, and their ability to continue to prosper and plunder the land, and so on. So the kings are always, when they were to elect a king, the interests of the British were always, shall we say, in the picture. But yet, within this very precarious, shall we say, geopolitical structure, within this precarious situation, you find the emergence of scholars and kings, such as Sultan Sulaiman and Sultan Iskandar, in which they were able to develop their lands, they were able to develop their people, develop the education system, develop the religious observance of the people, and the development of moral characters of these people, despite the influence and the existence of the colonial powers. So that is why, right through to the independence, we can see that despite having been colonized for, say centuries in this part of the world by different colonizers from different countries and states, yet we are able to persist in the most primary constituents of our sense of identity, that means in the sense of religion and in the sense of culture, as well as in the sense of language, because of the existence of such scholar kings, the Rabbul Saif wal Qalam. Yes? So they were, that means to say that these kings, they knew that despite being, shall we say, technologically or militarily dependent or militarily perhaps inferior to the external powers, such that you have to take on the burden of being colonized, that does not stop you from developing your people in the realm and the ideas that matter to ensure the unity, which is a source of power and the source of the integrity of the people and the source of independence of the people, to determine at least a very significant portion of their lives. That is why, according to, shall we say, many people, in particular those who live under the rule of such sultans, including, shall we say, the sultans who were perhaps not themselves scholars, but who aligned themselves to scholars, who were very close to scholars, such as the kings and the sultans of Johor, for example, in which you will find the muftis, yes, from Habib Salim bin Abdullah Al-Attas down to Habib Alwi bin Tahir Al-Haddad in the 20th century, you will find that for the people who live under the, shall we say, the very turbulent times, that they will not feel the yoke of colonization, with few exceptions, yes, in times of crisis. But when there's no crisis, the one that has to suffer the burden will only be at the topmost, but at the lower levels of the people, they are free to develop themselves and they are free to live religious lives. That means to say they are free to perform. There are 5 requirements of the religion in that sense. That means to say there is something of the nature of barakah of the Malay world. Yes, imagine, yes, nearly 100 million people of the entirety of the Malay archipelago. Despite being attacked, despite being colonized, you maintain becoming a people who are the toughest to convert out of Islam. Yes, because of the very strong identity that has been passed from generation to generation, that you still continue to produce scholars from generation to generation, that there can be continued resistance precisely due to the, shall we say, the awareness of your identity, which is secure on the foundation of knowledge. Where knowledge, where, shall we say, lot of pen and sword is concerned, I would say that where this concept is concerned, I have talked now about a king or kings who are scholars. But this concept, the Rabbu Saif wal Qalam, the Lord of Pen and Sword, is at least relevant in 2 more situations. And this, of course, is not found in the Thamaratul Muhimmah. It's just the result of some reflection and some reading and some sitting with the scholars over the years. Now I've come to realize that there is at least, as we said, 2 further categories of the Lord of Pen and Sword. So we've spoken about kings who are scholars. Another instance of the Lord of Pen and Sword is a person who gives up the sword for the sake of the pen. And as a result of that, ensured the stability of the people. This in particular is the case of Al-Faqih Al-Muqaddam. Yes, the most distinguished jurist, or the foremost in knowledge of religion, according to Professor Naqib Al-Attas. Yes, Al-Faqih Al-Muqaddam was a scholar in Hadramaut, a descendant of Sayyidina Hussein. During that time, the situation in Yemen was such that this was nearly 1,000 years ago. He was a few generations after Ahmad bin Isa. Ahmad bin Isa Al-Muhajir, perhaps the 10th or 11th grandson of the Prophet, he migrated away from Basra, which was at that time the epicenter of politics and Muslim rule, down to Medina, and then gradually arrived at Hadramaut, Southern Arabia. Ahmad bin Isa Al-Muhajir was laid to rest in Husaisa, near Tarim. His descendants would continue to remain and stay in the blessed town of Tarim and become scholars there and teach the religion and become most distinguished in the religious sciences and the spiritual sciences and spiritual practice. After a few generations of migration from Ahmad bin Isa al-Muhajir, they began to secure their position in the hearts of the people. At that time, the people who inhabited these lands were people of various tribes who were constantly at war with each other. So since the tribes were constantly at war with each other, this threatens to be a repeat of the situation in Medina, where the Prophet Muhammad was entrusted to, shall we say, to make peace between the different tribes. The Habaib, or the Ba'alawi, when they came to this part of the town, they warned people with their beautiful attributes, with their knowledge. But from the time of Ahmad bin Isa down to Faqih Al-Muqaddam, before Faqih Al-Muqaddam, they also carried weapons. They carried swords. That means to say, as a mark of distinction, as a mark of, shall we say, protection also, but also more pertinently, as a mark and a symbol of power. Yes, that's the saif. That means to say, you are able to enforce the security of your own people. You are able to protect your qabila, the honor of your tribe in that sense. But during the time of Al-Faqih Al-Muqaddam, he is of the descendant of the Prophet who reached the highest stations in the spiritual maqamat as well as in the knowledge sense. His scholarship was recognized and acknowledged by the scholars who were living at that time. He discussed with Sa'id Al-Amudi, another scholar of that time, about the survival of the Ba'alawis and their responsibility as successors to the Prophet, being of the prophetic household, how to ensure the continued succession of Islam in the world, that they would continue to propagate Islam when people have begun to deviate and people have begun to sacrifice their religion for the sake of this world. One of the most symbolic actions that he did was to break up his sword. Yes, and when he broke up his sword, the pieces of the sword still remains today buried with Sa'id al-Amudi. If you visit Yemen, if you visit the town of Tarim and Adan and Wadi Daw'an, you will see that the traces of these people remain until today. The effect of that action, when he broke up the sword, reliant on the pen, is such that he was able to achieve the measures of uniting the people. They became the arbiters between the warring tribes. Because now the warring tribes had a group of people that they can trust, who are of the highest moral stature, to resolve their disputes. And even when the swords were traded for guns, the Ba'alawis remain the arbiters of the people, and they remain the people who are educating the ethical and the moral foundations which is central to founding of a state and a nation. And they would survive even until modern Yemen, even until when they were threatened, shall we say, with the communist fitna in the 20th century. Yes, that measure, that beautiful ijtihad by Al-Faqih Al-Muqaddam would be characteristic of the Ba'alawi way, to such an extent that from that period was formulated the special recipe for the missionary activity in this part of the world also. Yes, it is due to that initial ijtihad that when they came and they brought Islam to this part of the world, not a single sword was lifted also. Yes, imagine, yes, the islands which were diverse and many, all became Muslim, and they set up and established Islamic kingdoms into this part of the world, and they developed the language, the Malay language, they developed the intellectual tradition here, they developed the scholarly tradition here, they supplied the requirements of religious foundations and institutions in this part of the world, all using the Faqih Muqaddam model. Yes, and today, as attested by some of the scholars, and you will see more of these scholars attesting to this fact, because you have now begun to see that scholars, Muslim scholars of the European world, when they came into this part of the world, they marvel at how this was able to be accomplished in this part of the world, and they now come to the realization that only the model of the Islamization of the Malay world primarily is the one that will survive the 21st century. That means to say, a model of Islamization based on strength of knowledge and strength of character and resolution. The giving up of the sword for the sake of the pen. So this is the second meaning. Yes? Alhamdulillah. Yes, these are, I think, new findings. If any one of you wants to write a thesis on this, or a book on the meanings of pen and sword. So the first is, as we said, kings who are scholars. The second, the scholars who became kings, but their ruling is of the heart of the people. Now the third category. Yes, the third category. When they gave up, as we said just now in the beginning, when Al-Faqih Al-Muqaddam gave up the sword for the sake of the pen writes with mercy and love. The pen writes treatises whose source is the Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam Al-Ghazali. The pen writes works which edify the soul. The pen writes works which form the character and attribute of the people so that they become civilized. Plato has struck the attention of the entirety of Western civilization by his unanswered question. In the Republic, I think he once said that it is a real surprise to any thinking people that when it comes to any crafts other than rule, where any other crafts other than ruling, you would have to be trained in it. You would have to spend time being trained under skilled masters. For example, when you look at the craft of, shall we say, weaving, when you look at the craft of shape making, when you look at the craft of medicine, you will always have to have spent time with the master, practicing the art and the craft for a certain period of time until you're recognized by the master. Only then you become a trustworthy shape maker. So that means to say this tradition of requiring legitimacy has always been around for human beings. Like, would you, for example, trust your fate on a shape maker who's just building his first ship? I know my friend, Yusuf, he's also involved in the craft of making and building. Yes? Would you trust him if he were to build your house, if he were to tell you, by the way, this is the first house I'm building? You wouldn't trust him, isn't it? All will require long years of training and apprenticeship. After a while, when you're ready to rule, or when you're ready to practice your craft, then you become that craft. So according to Plato, it is so interesting, or rather, one of the question that remains to be answered is that, why is it that of all the most important of all crafts, which is the ruling of human beings, no such training is required, isn't it? Somebody can just enter into politics and become a leader. Isn't that the case? Is it still the case today, or do you still have to go to a proper school before you can become a ruler? I don't think so, isn't it? Until today, that question by Plato is left unanswered. At least, the scholars in the Muslim intellectual tradition have developed treatises in this. They have developed a special discipline to train leaders, to train rulers. You would have to become a king by practice in ruling. And there needs to be a criteria of selection, so that between the princes, only the one who is most adept will rule. Because it's a simple wisdom. Yes, as the Prophet Muhammad himself said, you entrust something to someone who is incompetent, the thing will result in perdition and destruction. It's simple, isn't it? You wouldn't trust someone with shaky hands to bake your cake. You wouldn't trust someone with shaky hands to be, performing surgery on you. But why is it that when it comes to the most important of all crafts, that means to say in the ruling of your political future, you would trust it to anybody who pretends to be a trustworthy person? Yes? So Plato struck that very deep chord in the Western civilization. And so the effort of Western civilization since the time of Plato until now in the tradition of political philosophy is to think about how to produce this perfect citizen. Yes? And they have designed their intellectual, their university system, their education system precisely to produce this good citizen. But unfortunately, that is all that they are able to aim for, because for them, the good citizen is not necessarily a good man. The good citizen is merely a competent ruler where ruling is concerned. And they develop all these other institutions. Precisely to facilitate that. But yet, shall we say, the weaknesses, the midnight aspects of the soul are still left unchanged. So now, I think, before we finish or before we end, I would like to explore a third category of the Rabbul Sayf wal Qalam. In the third category of the Rabbul Sayf wal Qalam, the Lord of Pen and Sword, I think I first discovered it when I read the biographical entry on Professor Said Naqib Al-Attas in Arabic, in a book called the Shamsul Zahira. Yes, the Shamsul Zahira. This is a biographical dictionary that gathers together the life history of the most prominent Ba'alawis in the world. From the times of history right down to our time. And I saw that the entry on Professor Naqib Al-Attas, the title there says Rabbul Sayf wal Qalam, Lord of Pen and Sword. So if he is declared by that scholar to be the Lord of Pen and Sword, in what way is he a master wielder of both the pen and the sword? Obviously, not in the Sultan Sulaiman and Sultan Iskandar sense of the word. because he didn't hold political office. He was, of course, briefly involved in the stint with the Gerakan political party, but he really joined there as he said in one of the Saturday night lectures, so that he can debate some of his opponents, like Lim Kit Siang at that time, on the foundations of Malaysian, shall we say, cultural substratum. And after the debate, in which he has secured at least the intellectual victory at that time, he resigned and continued his effort in building the nation as an educator. So he is not a ruler in the political sense of the term, as we narrowly understand it today. Nor is he, in the faqih, muqaddam sense of the word, merely writing works of the spiritual edification, although some of his works involve these matters. He is of a wider category than that. And his being the Lord of the pen and sword, I think, owes to the fact that he is the first to have combined them both. In that his pen is his sword. Not like what you think. Not like, using a pen literally as a sword. But his knowledge is the penetrative weapon. And why is that? Not because, why is that? I shall say because of his understanding that Allah has granted him of the nature of the confrontation between Western civilization and Islamic civilization. In the beginning, when Islam first emerged in history, yes, in the 7th century, when Western civilization and culture had its acme, or had its focus in the lands of Byzantium as well as Western Roman Empire, when at that time Islam in Arabia was, shall we say, sandwiched between the Persian Empire and the Western Empire, or rather the Roman Empire. At that time, when Islam first emerged in history, the Christians, or the Western Christians, they were, shall we say, first confronted in the theological and the philosophical sense of the word, because the crux of the Quranic message challenged some foundational articles of their faith. Yes, with Qul Huwallahu Ahad, for example, Allahu Samad, Lam Yalid wa Lam Yulad, yes, that God does not beget a son, nor was he begotten. That already challenges a foundational article in Western Christendom. This theological challenge by Islam against Western civilization at that time was then met with military, political, and economic ventures of the Muslims. When the Muslims expanded themselves and expanded itself into what is now Syria, but what was then Eastern Roman Empire, the Western people suddenly saw this, shall we say, a power coming from the East that spread westwards, and westwards that pushed the Western people northwards and westwards. What happened, according to the Belgian historian Henri Pirenne, was that what was then the Mediterranean Sea, and what was across of the Mediterranean Sea, which was a source of livelihood as well as a source of culture for the Western people, became now, shall we say, removed from their panorama. It became removed also to such an extent that it was declared the Muslim League. Now, this being blockaded in the economic, military, and the political sense of the word changed Western history forever. Because now, when they are now forced to move westwards and northwards, changing even the seat of, shall we say, the Roman papacy, when the Romans have now had to work with the Germanic kings, in particular Charlemagne, it changed the shape of European history because it changed their very identity. It changed their very nature and foundation of their culture. So this confrontation between Islam and the West in the beginning was not only theological and philosophical, but also military, political, and economic, such that within the few centuries that came later, they would begin their series of crusades against the Muslims. So at that time, shall we say, there was both a battle in the intellectual, religious sense of the word, as well as the physical, political, military sense of the word, in the sense of the Crusades. Yes, part of it, you have the Richard the Lionheart, you had Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi, so you had alternating battles. And then you saw the rise of the Ottomans, in which the Ottomans came as far as Vienna. The Ottomans conquered Constantinople and changed it to Istanbul. This, shall we say, rhythm in history colored forever Western perception of Islamic civilization, such that it colored the foundations of Orientalist studies in the 17th, 18th and 19th century, such that remnants of that enmity towards Islam and the Turks in particular remain up till this day among certain quarters in the political and the military sense of the word. But as Professor Al-Attas has said, with the scientific revolution in the West and gradually followed by the Renaissance and followed by the Enlightenment, followed by the technological and industrial revolutions, when they are able to reconquer the lands that they were lost, they continued the adventures of conquest down to this part of the world with Alfonso de Albuquerque, when they conquered, for example, the Straits of Malacca, and they began their imperialistic rules in the political and military sense of the word. After that, two of the measures that they took were also first to effectively remove, or shall we say, to effectively deroot the Muslims from the Islamic civilization and intellectual tradition that they came from. And the second is to introduce Western modes of thinking, Western modes of knowing via the inculturation of the universities and the university systems and the education systems, such that that which was secured initially through economic, political and militaristic ways and means is now secured primarily through the means of intellectual, psychological and educational means. So the first battle for the Muslims now is how to liberate their minds, so that the field of confrontation, which came from the militaristic and the political and the economic, has now shifted the grounds, according to Professor Naqib Al-Attas, and the ground is now the intellectual confrontation. And this confrontation is not just the confrontation in the sense of history and politics, but more so, it is a confrontation of worldviews. And the nature of this confrontation, yes, which focuses on the differences in worldviews, will require a certain type of a scholar. And this scholar must be somebody who understands his own tradition well, his own sources of the civilization well as understanding the West well, such that to become the Lord of Pen and Sword today will mean somebody who commands the respect of the Muslims at least. In that, to lead this intellectual confrontation, and the aim is to secure our own identities and our own worldviews, will require again a lot of the pen and the sword. The sword will have to be sharpened again. The pen will have to be sharpened again, in the sense of resecuring our own understanding of the world, which is the more precarious. And now the battle is in the minds, and the battle is in the hearts, and the battle is for your own aqidah in that sense. And it gives a new significance to a tradition which is reported in the Ihya Ulumuddin, when Imam Al-Ghazali said, the ink of the martyr, when it is measured against the blood, the ink of the scholars, when it is measured against the blood of the martyrs, is heavier. And I think with that note, I'd like to end the night's discussion and open for questions if you have any. Thank you.